Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the summer meeting of Granite State taxpayers. Thank you for coming out tonight through the rain and weather. This is a perfect night to be talking about the weather and climate. Granite State taxpayers is the state's oldest statewide taxpayer group, founded in 1990 by the late Governor Mel Thompson, who famously said low taxes are the result of low spending. We advocate for lower taxes. We advocate for less regulation, things like better election law. And most recently, we started to take a look at some of the bills going through Concord that are driven by climate change, or more particularly, the green climate agenda. And the one that caught our attention was the one about net metering and the attempt to expand the facilities and generators subject to net metering from 1 megawatt, which would be a solar panel about the size of the roof of this building we're in, to 5 megawatts, which is acres and acres. Why does this matter? It matters because each of these facilities under the net metering program are allowed to sell excess energy back into the grid, but they sell it at retail rates, unlike other sellers of energy that provide it for wholesale rates. So what this does is, in effect, gives an incentive for these types of solar panels and gives a special incentive to investors in those panels. Why is this important? Because the difference in cost now is passed on to ratepayers like you and I. So we started to look into this, and as you are well aware, these are all driven by people who believe in what is called the green agenda. So we started looking for people who could bring us some wisdom on the question of how much of this climate change is really driven by fact. And we found Joe DeLeo. Joe DeLeo, as you may know, is the co-founder of the Weather Channel. He's a fellow with the American Meteorological Society, a certified climate forecaster. He spent 48 years investigating weather, climate, and has done research and issued peer-reviewed papers in areas such as multivariate forecasting and climate change, including the effect of sun cycles on the Earth and its weather. So without further ado, he will give us some information on the real facts of climate change. And Joe, thank you for being here tonight. Our pleasure to have you.
And I brought a book that the original pioneers of the Weather Channel authored last year. It describes how we got together and made it happen. If you're interested, I've got some copies. Anyway, we're going to talk about the real facts of climate change. And the only constant in nature is change. We are lucky to be where we are in terms of our climate. Most of the history, going back 400,000 years or so, the Earth has been much colder, like 20 degrees colder than it is currently. We're in what we call an interglacial period. It lasts 10 to 15,000 years. And in the interglacial period, ice forms at high latitudes and spreads south. This is what it looked like at the bottom of the interglacial period, the bottom of the blue line there on the right. I can point to it here. And it covered our region here with a mile of ice. And Long Island is actually what we call a terminal moraine. It's where the glacier pushed the rocks and the soil, and when it left and retreated to the north, Long Island was left behind. But it also carved out the Great Lakes and left them behind as well. Now, in this interglacial period, there's ups and downs too. There are warm periods and cold periods. And every warm period has been an advance in civilization. The Great Greek era and the Roman era. In the medieval warm period, the Vikings settled Greenland and grew crops there. The ice had retreated. They grew fine grapes and made wine there in northern England. You don't find that now, obviously. They left when it turned colder. The current warming, according to the ice cores from Greenland, is not quite to the level of the recent ones. You see we're coming down off of the peak in this interglacial. We're more likely, not in our lifetime, but in the next 5,000 years to go into another cold period, not a warm period. Is air pollution an issue now? Now, I've always been an environmentalist and conservationist. I worked on my doctorate with an atmospheric chemistry grant. In the post-war boom, we had problems with air pollution from factories, coal plants, cars, inefficient home heating systems, and incinerators in apartments. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and I remember getting up in the morning and finding soot on my car. We brushed it off, not my car, my father's car. We would brush it off like we brush pollen off the cars. You don't see that today, do you? We had air quality issues with pollutants like soot and SO2, sulfur dioxide, ozone, hydrocarbons, nitrous oxide, and lead. But we set standards and that had to be met by industry and automakers, and we have the cleanest air in my lifetime and in the world today. You all remember driving down the roads behind a diesel bus, right? Or how much pollution there was. That's not an issue anymore. Now, carbon dioxide, notice, was not on the list. It's not a pollutant. It's a trace gas. When I ask people in the group, how much of the atmosphere you think is carbon dioxide? Oh, 20%, 30%? No, try 0.04% of the atmosphere is CO2. It's not a pollutant. It's a beneficial gas. It's essential for photosynthesis. Plants are enriched and are more vigorous and have lower water needs with more CO2. They're more drought resistant. Ideal CO2 levels for crops would be 3 or 4 times higher than what we have in the air today, not less. They're trying to, we got to put it back in the ground. No, we got to feed it to the plants. They pump CO2 into the greenhouses at 3 or 4 times what we find in the ambient air. And here's an experiment where they grew pine with different carbon dioxide, 410 parts per million. And when you double the carbon dioxide, the trees are much bigger. And crops are much bigger, 40% greater biomass when they tried that with soybeans in South America. And you look at this, vegetation increased threefold in the past 50 years. This is a NASA graph that shows only 10% more land was involved, but was much greener. So we're able to feed the world population that had doubled over that time period. To show that CO2 feeds the plant, and on the top we have the March picture, and red is high. So the CO2 increases in the winter when the plants are dormant. But when the plants come out, they eat, right? And the bottom, it's very low. So they eat, there's a cycle in the carbon dioxide on an annual basis. Oh, well, wait a minute. They're talking about carbon pollution. I heard it on the radio, on TV. Well, they were talking about particulate matter. They were talking about soot. See, they were trying to confuse you. And they're not talking about CO2. That's not carbon pollution. Soot is carbon pollution. China and India do have problems with that, where they're building coal plants very quickly, and they're not scrubbing the outflow. And you remember this ad in the election not too many years ago, I think maybe 2012. They paid American Lung Association $4 million to do that ad. Remember the baby carriage with a child in it? That's not CO2 issue, and it's not an air pollutant. Let me go back and look at breathing air. When we breathe in air, we breathe in 410 parts per million. When we breathe out, we have 441,000 parts per million. We breathe out 1,000 times more CO2 than we breathe in. How can it be a pollutant? How's it going to affect your health when you produce more when you breathe out than you breathe in? The particulates, the small particulates, which you're talking about, we set goals, and we beat those goals. We beat the standards. We passed the standards. We're well below the national standard for particulates, a 41% decrease. We should applaud ourselves for that. Similar progress was made with the other pollutants. Now, in China, they do have a problem. You see the fog that forms there in India. We In China, they have cold air that drains from Siberia down in there. It's shallow, produces an inversion, and it traps the pollutants in there, particulates, but it also traps sulfur dioxide. And when you mix sulfur dioxide with water droplets, you get sulfuric acid mist. And you breathe that in very long, and you have problems. And it happened before in the West, before we cleaned up our act. In Denora, Pennsylvania, 6,000 of the 14,000 people in the population experienced damaged lungs from an event like that we saw in China. In London, in 1952, 6,000 people actually died in a air pollution event with the smog. Okay, so what's this about greenhouse effects? CO2 is supposed to be trapping our air like the greenhouse glass traps the heat. The greenhouse glass is a factor. The sun comes in, visible ultraviolet radiation comes through, warms the inside. You have it shut off so that the wind can't take that warmth away. But also the energy that comes in, it warms the plants in the inside, and it emits infrared radiation. And that doesn't all escape the glass, so it gets trapped. And the plants benefit, and they say, well, that's what's going to happen in the atmosphere with CO2. And so the greenhouse models build in CO2, but they don't tell you that the real driver for their warming is CO2 plus water vapor, because water vapor is 95% of the greenhouse effect in the atmosphere. And today when this water evaporates, we're going to add moisture into the air, and it's going to hold up temperatures. But you see in the model here, in the greenhouse model, this is South Pole on the left, North Pole on the right, the bottom of the atmosphere at the bottom and the top of the atmosphere on top. And the models produce this heat in the tropics in 30 to 40,000 feet because of the rising air that the water vapor gets taken up, and CO2 increase causes the heat to accumulate in that region. It's called a tropical hotspot. Okay, it also warms the lower levels and higher latitudes, either side of the equator. Well, here's 4 other models, an example of that hotspot. And again, South Pole left, right, right, and North Pole right, bottom to top. And you see that they all are consistent in showing this warming. But the balloons, weather balloons and satellite, in that layer, in that little area where it's supposed to be getting hot, they show no change since 1979. So these models have failed. The same thing for the ocean underneath. Now, if the atmosphere warms and all the way down, the ocean should be warming. But in the tropics, there's been no warming in the oceans from 1979 to the present. Then you look at the models themselves, and there are a whole series of 102 models shown, this scattered diagram, and the red line on top is the average. It's showing how much warmer we're supposed to get. Now, the blue and the purple and the green line circles show the actual temperature in the mid-troposphere, in the tropics. And you see that the models are greatly overstating the warming by a factor of 3 or more. So the theory is failing. There's one little model. See, it says the Russian model. They downplayed the greenhouse effect and included the solar effect. And they're the only model of all of them that got it right. Now, the climate control knobs in the climate models that they run globally are primarily water vapor and CO2. And this cartoon shows that they're ignoring the real drivers, the ocean and the sun. And I could spend another day talking to you about that. We're not going to do that today, but they're the real drivers. And one in the Climate Gate emails that were found from the scientists speaking their real thoughts, one said, what if the climate change appears to be mainly a multi-decadal natural fluctuation? They'll kill us, probably. Okay, so we've been taking the Earth's temperature. How long have we been doing that? They talk about temperatures back into the 1800s. So we were tracking global temperatures way back, right? No, actually, the first time we attempted to assemble a northern hemisphere, not a global, but just a northern hemisphere land temperature, was in the mid-1970s. The National Academy of Science, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, pulled together as many stations as they could find in the northern hemisphere, going back into the 1880s. They found that it had warmed 2 degrees from 1880 to 1938, and then cooled a whole degree down into the 1960s. Interesting. Well, the U.S. Temperature, the first time we assembled a U.S. temperature was 1989. That wasn't that many years ago. How many? 30 years ago? And it showed the similar thing, a warming to about 1938, and then a cooling, and then another warming after 1970, the late 1970s. If you're old enough, you remember how cold they were. That was the bottom of the cold time, and then it started warming. But you notice that 1997, 1998 was not as warm as 1934. And the New York Times said U.S. data in 1989 now, since 1895, fails to show a warming trend. The study was made by NOAA. The U.S. Weather Service, NOAA, considered a very important factor called the urban heat island. Now, you watch the local TV news, right, at night, weather, and they'll say, the low tonight in Boston will be near 40 degrees, but if you live out in the suburbs, it may be a few upper 20s. High tomorrow near 50. Why is that? Because during the day, the cities with vertical walls, steel and concrete, absorb the heat from the sun and give it off slowly at night, so that they tend to stay warmer in the cities, in the urban areas. And cities grow around airports where we measure temperatures. And you see here, this is London on the top right, and you see how much warmer it is in downtown London than it is in the surrounding areas. And this is true in all cities worldwide. In fact, the head of the National Climate Data Center, Tom Carl, a friend of mine, at least he was, defined the first, what we call the urban heat island adjustment for the first version of the data for the U.S., which I just showed you. And he said, trends from surface temperatures, predominantly from urban stations, are likely to have a serious warm bias, maybe about 6 degrees Fahrenheit per century. The rate has increased after the 1950s, commensurate with large growth in and around the airports. We were 20% airports back at the beginning, now we're 70%, now better than that. Most stations are airport. And he said this must be taken into account when we're assessing change in temperature. Inexplicably, you'll see the adjustment that they made was removed. This is what an airport location, some of the problems. You have all that concrete, all that tarmac, all the buildings, but you also have the exhaust from the airplanes that can warm up your temperature sensor in the Stevenson shelter. NASA's Edward Long did a study looking at urban versus rural and found that the rural shows a nice cyclical change that we can explain with the oceans and the sun, but the urban accelerates upwards. The dilemma that they had was that the U.S. temperatures showed that 60-year cycle, but the global temperatures, and the first version of that officially came out every month, was in 1992. It showed that it had no adjustment for urban heat island. It reflected the urban heat island and showed more of a straight-up warming. That they said, that fits our theory, our model of greenhouse warming better. So the dilemma was, do you go with and adjust that global data to the U.S. temperatures and get an accurate global view, or do you adjust the U.S. data to fit the global view? Actually, if you, Dr. Willie Soon, a friend of mine, looked at the rural stations globally, and it has that blue, that cycle. Well, instead, they went the route of, this is the original one I showed you a minute ago, of removing the urban heat island adjustment in version 2 in after 2000. And so with that, suddenly now 1998, which had been a degree colder than 1934, was now warmer, and you had an apparent warming. And if you looked at the report measured data, in blue was what actually the thermometers were telling us, but what they were telling the world was in red. It fit their theory, right? And this is Maine. I did a talk in Maine. They said, please come up and tell us the truth about climate. I downloaded data from the National Climate Data Center in 2011. I found no statistical annual trend. The 1913 was 46, the warmest year. The trend was actually minus 0.01 degree per decade, 0.1 degree per century, not significant at all. Well, he asked me back to give a reprise 2 years later, and so I downloaded the same data, and wow. Now we had warming of 0.23 degrees per decade, or 2.3 degrees per century. That's, they actually had a story in the Portland Press Herald saying, Maine is warming faster than any other state in the country. Well, it wasn't 2 years ago, it was actually cooling. Instead of adjusting the models to fit the data, they're adjusting the data that fits their models. Well, even if you look at the adjusted data, which is shown, it's still a cyclical behavior in it. The recent peak was higher than the one in the 1930s. There's less than half of the time, only 40% of the time, was the CO2 going up at the same time temperatures were going up. Okay. If you're successful 40% of the time and you're a hitter in baseball, you go to the Hall of Fame. In weather, climate, and economic forecasting or commodity trading, you find another job. Okay. Global temperatures, I said, were operational in 1992. And you see, this is what we had that was reliable over the entire record. In the southern hemisphere, forget it. Nothing in the oceans. Okay, in the northern hemisphere, we had US as the best data. In Europe, we had decent data. Australia, we had decent data. You see how it changed. The stations reported in 1900, very sparse. It increased in 1976, but then mysteriously decreased when they came up with their new analysis, global analysis. They dropped off 4,500 stations, 75% of the stations. And they dropped off most of the rural areas and most of the high latitude ones. How do I know? Because when you plot the number of stations, you see the stations in blue, the number drops, but notice the temperature, average temperature of all of them jumps up, steps up. Because they've eliminated the rural and high latitude stations, you get a warmer result. And there's also, for the stations that you do have, there are many of the continents, or 70 to 90% of the stations are missing months in the year. Now, in the bottom right, you see one station. This is representative. This is out of Siberia. The red represents missing months. Now, you have up to 7 months out of the year missing. Now, how do you come up with an average temperature for a year if you don't know what 5 or 7 months were in a year? You can't. Okay? And it's like trying to guess who won the game between the Yankees and the Red Sox if you only know what happened in the 3rd, 4th, and 7th inning. Okay, this on the top left is an actual plot of recent, September 2018, from NASA, of the temperatures for the month. And all the areas in gray had no data, so they have to fill in the data. They come up with algorithms to try to fill in the holes. And notice in Northeast Africa and Middle East, there's no stations there, but it's the record hottest it's ever been for September in that location. If you look at Europe, and I can give you many examples, I'll just pick 1 or 2 for the regions with data. We've already looked at the US. Here's Reykjavik in Iceland. We had tracked that And we see that 60-year cycle that goes along with the ocean cycles. When the ocean's warm, Iceland's going to be warm. When the ocean is cold, Iceland's going to be cold. And you see what on the left, what they were reporting, and after the adjustment, what NOAA was reporting for Iceland. And they were challenged. They said, well, is this what you believe on the right? And they said, no, no, no. The one on the left is what we believe. We did it ourselves. We did it right. And then here's Australia. In blue is the actual observations. But they sent a U.S. NOAA representative over to New Zealand and Australia, and he told them how to reanalyze the data, and the red is what resulted in two stations. I could show you lots of them. And NASA, in black was the original one in 1981, but notice each version keeps pushing down the past, making it colder and colder to make the current look warmer and warmer. Well, I mentioned there was not much data in the south of the equator in the oceans. And the southern hemisphere is 81% ocean. The globe is 71% ocean. And they changed the way we measured temperatures over, mostly ship data and satellite data after the 1970s. And then finally, they got it right after about 2000. They put buoys in the oceans, all around the 3,907 buoys covering all of the oceans. They measure the surface temperatures precisely. They dive to 2,000 meters, give you heat content. Well, this is great, right? But global warming disappeared for 18 years. It got so long, when it was 10 years, they said, well, it has to be more than 17 for it to be statistically significant. They couldn't ignore it when it got over 18. So they started publishing papers in Nature magazine, and a lead author from the UN report said, well, natural factors like El Nino, ocean cycles have an effect. They had 3 panels at the AMS annual American Meteorological Society annual meeting in 2015 to address the pause. None of them really were experienced with the factors that we look at that really drive climate, but never mind. Then later in 2005, NOAA made the pause go away by adjusting the Argo data. And this man, who has been with NOAA for a long time, John Bates, data quality officer, quit. He said, Tom Carl, in the paper in Science in 2015, just a few months before we met in Paris to agree on the costly Paris Climate Accord, removed the inconvenient pause by altering the ocean temperatures. They had good data from buoys and corrected it by using bad data from ships. He said, you never take good data you never change good data to agree with bad. It made the sea look warmer. And red is what the buoys told us the trend was. In blue, with the adjustment, we had warming, solved their problem. If we torture the data long enough, it will confess. Okay, so the UN took a global poll in 2015. Not all countries, 9,736,000 votes, and what were the most important issues to them? Good education, better health care, better job opportunities, an honest and responsive government, affordable and nutritious food, protection against crime and violence, access to clean water and sanitation. All of those make sense, right? But at the very bottom is action taken on climate change. So what do we do? Well, call out the Sky is Falling team that started and increase their hyping of extreme weather, right? Heat waves, we're going to all fry in heat waves. Heat waves are not increasing. The 1930s had 23 of the 50 state all-time records. 38 of them occurred before 1960. Since the 1940s, we've had more state record cold. We had another one this year than record highs. Where's your increase in heat? Here's your 90-degree readings at all stations in the United States. It's been going down since the 1930s. The number of days over 100 and 105 have declined since the 1930s. And even the EPA maintains a heat wave index and you see it peaks in the 1930s. We don't have a heat wave problem anymore. The number of record high temperatures in all stations that have a long-term record, obviously, if you only included the stations you started 20 years ago, they're going to show the record in the last 20 years. You had to go look at, there were 804 of them that went back at least 100 years. The top 10 occurred before 1955, okay? And it's going down the trend. Oh, that isn't going to work. When they did the National Climate Assessment, they finessed the issue. They created a ratio of record highs to record lows. They're both declining. Record highs are declining, I showed you that. Record lows are declining even faster because of the urban heat island. It's keeping temperatures up at night. So they do that ratio instead of showing the actual highs, and when they show the red, they imply that heat waves are getting worse, right? But they're not. Nights are getting a little warmer, which is all right for most of us, right? If our plants like it too, more growing degree days. And by the way, 1 or 2 degrees is not, in 12 years, it's not going to kill us all when you consider that the extremes between the highest ever and lowest ever are 156 degrees here in New Hampshire, and most of the country over 130, 140 degrees, most of every state. You're not even going to notice. In here, there's probably a 5 or 6 degree difference from one end of the room to the other. In your house, think of your garage, your first floor, your kitchen, near the fireplace, upstairs, the attic, the back bedroom. It's 10 degrees difference in your house. 1 or 2 degrees will not be noticed. On a global basis, the all-time record highs were all old, they're not recent. Let's look at some of the other claims. Droughts and floods, they're getting worse, and it's climate change. Well, actually, NOAA said they can't find a trend. Droughts actually been going down. This year, we had the smallest area coverage of drought earlier this year ever recorded in the United States, and since they've been doing that for 20 years. But it's been going down. We had a wet year this year in the country, the downtrend for 30 years in drought. Sea levels are one of their favorite topics. But sea levels rose a lot when we had all that ice. When that ice melted, what do you think it went? Went into the oceans. Sea levels rose, right? The most. And then as the ice basically stabilized and mostly gone, it flattened in the last 5, 6, 7,000 years. And over the last century, you see it in the bottom, the sea level has been slowing, sea level rises. And in fact, it really all depends on, when you try to measure sea level, they report that, this place is going to be underwater, New York City or Virginia Beach or Miami. The land is sinking in places, and it's rising in other places. It's rising in Alaska. The plates are coming together, forcing the ground to rise, which makes it look like the sea level's falling, right? But along the Gulf and the East Coast, the land is sinking, so it accelerates the sea level. The only way you're going to get an accurate sea level change globally is to look at that little red box here, where it isn't, the tectonic change is not as small. And then you do that, you get your 4 inches per century, not 7 inches or the 240 feet that not Tom Carl, but Jim Hansen had predicted about 10 years ago. So they said, well, we're having trouble with our tide gauges not being consistent, so let's put technology to the job, okay? So they put up 2 satellites, or a number of satellites, GRACE and a radar, Invisat, and they said, now we're going to know what sea level is really doing. So when they get the data back, it's flat. So they stop reporting it for a while, and they come up with adjustments. That tectonic, isostatic, glacial isostatic adjustment. They're saying, well, the glaciers have retreated, and that's causing the land to seem to rise more than our models suggest, and so maybe if we adjust for that, we get back to where we thought it should be. Well, on the top right, ABC, the media is doing their job of pumping out stories about the hype. The top right, Noah's in ABC said in 2008, by 2015, New York City would be underwater, Manhattan will be underwater sooner than expected. Well, the sea data from 2008 to 2015, shown on the bottom, shows it didn't change an inch in that time period. On the left, National Geographic has done a number of covers that show Lady Liberty swimming. You see it here. At that level, it would take, at 4 inches a century, about 65,000 years to get to that level. And they actually have it almost to her bosom now, but never mind. In actual fact, since the ice, the interglacial periods last 10 to 15,000 years, and we're 10,500 years into the current interglacial, it is more likely that this scene from Day After Tomorrow is more likely to happen than her swimming. Not in that did it in one storm, that movie. It would take thousands of years, but that's the direction it's more likely than. Okay, wildfires, yes, they're real. They've always happened in the West. The wet season is fall into the winter and early spring, and then it's very dry and very hot. There have always been great fires in the West. We're not helping it. You know, environmentalists have great disdain for foresters, ranchers, and farmers. They don't want to give them any water from the snow melt. They don't want the foresters into the forest. They used to clear cut areas in the forest and plant new trees, and it would grow up, and and they could build in barriers to where they could stop the fire breaks. So there've been more fires in recent years, but partly also because people leave the cities and move up into the foothills. Wouldn't you? It's beautiful in the foothills, right, until the fires come and burn your house down. Well, when they build the developments in the foothills, they have to put power lines to them, right? And then they come down, and they've had transformers that come down, and they're built so that they keep trying to restart. Well, when you got trees and branches and all around, that makes it even worse. So PG&E is being sued for that. Now, one of my favorite topics is snowfall. The Union of Concerned Scientists at UNH did a special presentation in the summer of 2007 on Mount Washington, said we have a dire future for our winter sports and maple sugar industries here due to warming. What followed? That very year, mountains of snow occurred. Record snow fell from Alaska to the west, in Colorado and Wisconsin. Record snows in the mountains of northern New England from Maine to Vermont. The next year, they didn't get snow in Washington, so Princeton environmentalists Michael Oppenheimer and RFK Jr. bemoaned that their children would never get to enjoy sledding like they did when they were in the 1960s. So what happened next? Snowmageddon, 2009 and 10. Washington and all the cities set all-time record snows that following winter. They say, well, the trend is down. Well, the trend is down in spring and summer because they changed the way they did the assessment of global snowpack. But you can see in the fall, it's increasing. We set a record this year in North America and Northern Hemisphere too, was well above normal. Winter also has been going up. And in fact, this winter, according to the Finnish Met Service, we had well above normal snow in the Northern Hemisphere. And this is laid on top of the North American snow extent. Here in the Northeast, we had 29 high-impact snowstorms in the decades ending 2018. No other decade had more than 10. The 10-year running mean has never been higher than it was in Boston. So where's it? It's disappearing in the mountains, and the maple trees are going to pack their bags and go to Canada. There'll be no more maple sugaring. No. You remember 2014-15. This was my driveway. You may see my wife behind the wheel on the snowplow there, if you look carefully. And, well, snow is a thing of the past. How about the Arctic? Well, that's supposed to be gone. Remember 2007-8, they said it was going to be gone by 2012-13? It's diminished. They wait. Every year they talk about some area. Now you see the Bering Sea up by Alaska's below normal snow or ice this year, but that was due to storms in the North Pacific that pushed that out to sea. But it comes back every year. Now it varies in how much comes back with ocean temperatures, and it's floating on the Arctic, the ice. And so that means the water from both oceans can flow underneath, and if the Atlantic is warm, that current that goes underneath the ice will thin it from the bottom, all right? Same thing for the Pacific. What the International Arctic Research Center in Fairbanks at the university there showed, the top is the water temperatures. When the waters were warmer from the 20s to the 50s, the air temperature was warm in the Arctic, and at the bottom, the ice was below normal. And then when the water temperatures got cold, and after the 50s to the 80s, the air temperature got cold and the ice increased, and then it decreased. But they want you not to think about what happened before 1970 or 80. This is new, just assume that everything had been constant up to that point, and it's only this recent warming and ice decrease that we should worry about. When you look at both oceans and you add the ocean, effectively the ocean temperatures standardized for both oceans compared to the Arctic temperatures, I think you can see what's really driving the changes in the Arctic ice. And my friend Willie Soon showed that the sun is causing the ocean temperatures to behave like that. It fits the Arctic temperatures to a T, where CO2 does not. Look at the global temperatures, the U.S. temperatures, when you superimpose the ocean and the sun cycles on it. What do you think is driving it? Now, consider that the CO2 has been going up much of that time period. It's the sun driving the oceans, driving the temperatures. Polar bear populations are supposed to have declined 67%. Remember from that movie? They actually grew 25%. Tornadoes have declined, the strong ones, since 1954. We had a big year in 2011, then 7 years below the trend, and last year was the quietest in history. The average for the first 30 years was 55.9 per year, and then it dropped to 33.8 per year, lowest in history. But this year, it jumped up again in May. We had some in the south in February and March, and then April and May it came north. There were bad tornadoes, and a lot of them, but it was due to the extreme contrast in temperatures. You see on the left, warm temperatures don't produce tornadoes. Warm temperatures next to cold temperatures produces a strong jet stream, produces big storms that generate tornadoes. So you see on the left, last year when it was 2018, May, only 170 tornadoes, because it was warm everywhere. This year we had a record cold and snow in the central and warm in the southeast, and that alley between them was all these storms, one after another, 13 days. 556 tornadoes. So it was bad, but it wasn't climate change. It was local weather. Hurricanes, this is the total Atlantic action, the number of storms, the size of the storms, the duration, and it produces an accumulated cyclone energy index. And you see there are big years and quiet years, active years and periods and quiet periods. The biggest years were 1933, 2005. We had big years way in the past. In 1893, 1926, 33, 50, and recently 2004, 5, and 17. So, but that isn't, when the top two were 2005 and 1993, 1933 was before the satellite era. So we didn't know what was going on in the eastern Atlantic, unless a ship happened to be in that region, and there were very few. So it's very likely that 1933, which had been the top year, had even more back then. The trend has been down in hurricanes too. This is the quietest decade with a year to go in the entire record. Okay, so carbon emissions versus world prosperity versus poverty. I think it's a plus, don't you? Low-cost energy produces prosperity and helps families and reduces poverty. Well, we got to get rid of it. Global weather-related disaster losses as a proportion of GDP has been going down. It hasn't been getting worse. Extreme weather deaths have decreased since the early 1900s. But Joe, just in case you're wrong, wouldn't it be prudent to move away from carbon-based fossil fuels to wind and solar? We'd have cleaner air. We'd save money because the wind and the sun are free, right? It will save lives too. Well, experience tells us where they move aggressively to renewables, exactly the opposite happens. The law of unintended consequences. Think of New England, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, right? It's supposed to save us money, finance efficiency, does a little bit of that. Our air will be cleaner, it was clean enough. But the yellow states are all Reggie states. New Jersey and Virginia wants to get on fun, they may or be already. But look what effect it has on electricity prices. We've joined the crazies in California at the top of the energy, electric price. Look how much we pay more than the average state. New Hampshire was fourth. We bounce around third, fourth. Massachusetts, all of the New England states are up there, which is why the people are leaving. One of the reasons why, taxes and high energy costs. California's on the list. In parts of the world where they've gone much further with green initiatives, retail electricity prices are even higher. Look, we're at the bottom of the list there. Look at South Australia, Denmark, Germany at the top. How would you like to triple your electric bills every month? I don't know about you, but my bill in July is hard to swallow. Tripling it for what? More blackouts occur in these countries because the wind and the sun are not always there, and they're unreliable. Many households are said to be in energy poverty, 25% in the UK, 15% in Germany. 600,000 households in Germany had their electricity turned off because they couldn't pay their bills. Okay. And the elderly in the UK, when they have those cold winter months, is forced to choose between heating and eating. I have friends in the UK that tell me they sit in their apartment with the temperature set down to 50 degrees and their sweater and coats, drink hot tea, go to sleep at night underneath the blankets, and that's their existence. Look at the percentage of household income spent on energy by household income, percentage of household income spent on energy. You see, in the poor families that earn less than $20,000, they've spent already over 40% of their money on energy. And if you triple it, what happens? There's very little hope. And they don't tell you that cold is the real killer. There was a study that was done and published in The Lancet that looked at 74 million deaths in 340 locations, 13 countries, and it found that 20 times more people died from cold than died from heat. In the United States, the deaths per day are much higher in the 4 coldest months than they are in the warmest months. Cold is the killer, not heat. This is actually measured in Europe. It's called excess winter mortality. And that has actually slowed the growth globally of renewable energy. That they make you see, you think that it's exploding everywhere. We have to get in on it. They're building coal plants in Germany, in Japan, in Europe, because they got to keep the lights on. Bad science leads to bad policy hurts good people. Now, I just saw this, and I wanted to add this. In Ireland, there was a story that drivers will be forced off the road and population packed into higher density cities under a long-awaited climate plan, which will revolutionize people's lifestyle and behaviors. Nudge policies such as huge tax hikes, as well as bans and red tape outlined in the plan, will pave the way to a vibrant Ireland of zero carbon emissions by 2050. And we're going to add to the country, 4.7 million people, another million with mass immigration into Ireland. They're going to get in on the fun. Meanwhile, the Isle of Man Wildlife Charity reports that they have big offshore wind farms there, just off the coast. Many of the seabirds have disappeared. Herring gulls are down 82%. This is what wind turbines and Fred Ward would tell you. That's one of the unreported effects of wind farms. As to why they're doing all of this, I'm going to use their own words. Maurice Strong, UN Executive Director, saw CO2 as a tool to proselytize for one world government. Isn't it the only hope for the planet that the industrial civilization collapsed? Isn't it our job to bring that about? And at that meeting, everybody stood up and cheered when he said that. Can you imagine that? And then there were politicians from the United States and more than one president. In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, would fit the bill. It doesn't matter if this common enemy is a real one or one invented for the purpose. The Club of Rome, I should have brought the book with me, First Global Revolution. We have to ride this global warming issue, even if the theory is wrong. We're doing the right thing in terms of economic policy and environmental policy. Tim Wirth, a U.S. Senator and President of the UN Foundation. No matter if the science of global warming is all phony, climate change provides the greatest opportunity to bring about justice and equality, very popular words today. Christine Stewart, former Canadian minister. The UN's climate chief said, our aim is not to save the world from ecological calamity, but to change the global economic system. And her buddy, Otmar Edenhofer, in 2000 said, one has to free oneself from the illusion international climate policy is environmental policy. Instead, climate change is about how we redistribute de facto the world's wealth. The whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed and clamorous to be led to safety by menacing it with the endless series of hobgoblins, all of them imaginary. The urge to save humanity is almost always only a false phase for the urge to rule it, and that's what globalization is all about. And it's easier to fool people than to convince them that they have been fooled, and that's Mark Twain. Okay.
Any questions? It was pretty explanatory, I think. Before we get to questions, I want to comment on our website, www.granitstatetaxpayers.org. A couple weeks ago, we posted up, actually we sort of stole, a Dilbert column where Dilbert has done a profit forecast. And he goes before his boss, the pointy-haired devil, and he says, my forecast doesn't match your targets. And the pointy-haired devil tells him to adjust the variables in his forecast. And he said, because it doesn't matter. This is 4 years out, nobody can predict it. And I think the thing I took away from the first time I saw Joe's talk is a lot of what has gone on here seems to be the adjustment of variables to fit a desired outcome. So, Joe, I want to thank you for pointing that out. It's always a pleasure to listen to somebody who's really immersed in the details of a particular science. And Joe is one of those who has done that. So, okay, here's the way this is going to work. Dave McConville's back there with a microphone, and if you put your hand up, we'll go to the first one, which I think is Keith. So, Keith, talk into that microphone that Dave will give you, and that's going to wind up on the tape. Speak loud when you answer.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. Is this working?
That's going on the camera.
I'm sorry.
You got to talk loud so we can hear, because this is the only one.
Thank you for your talk. Public-funded science. Is it the case that public money is going to fund the science, and the outcomes that the politicians and the ruling class wants to hear is what's driving the results and the adjustment of variables? Is that true? How close to the truth is that?
It's absolutely true. A lot of people who share my realist view of climate, you can't get funding. Money pours, so it's said to be a $2 trillion industry globally per year. And if you're funded and you want to get refunded, you have to come to a conclusion they'll find acceptable, and then you'll keep getting funding. And I have friends that have spoken to programmers at different labs, and they said, "Do you really believe in these models are right?" I said, "No, we don't. But that, and when they come up with another idea, we'll work on that." But I have a wife, I have children at home. It's sinister, really.
Who is next? Start with Michael here.
Thank you. Also, check.
That's all right. Go ahead.
Okay. So I'd like to ask kind of a two-part question. The first is it fair to summarize what you've said as models that conclude that warming is anthropogenic are not empirically validated except where the data have been altered to fit the models? Is that about right?
That's exactly right.
Okay. The next part of my question is, so in their last report, the IPCC gave a range for climate sensitivity between like 1.5 degrees and 6 degrees. That's the change in global mean temperature, I think centigrade, to a doubling of CO2 in the atmosphere. That's a wide range. They wouldn't commit to even a best estimate because they said there was too much uncertainty. My question for you is, does that metric matter? And if it does, what would be your best estimate?
It's a wide range. They're trying to catch some of the balloon and satellite data, and so make it at least look like it's feasible. I've been doing climate forecasting for over 30 years, and my clients don't care whether I'm consistent with theory out there. They want the right answer. They're investing in the markets or whatever. And so we use natural factors and do a much better job than any of the models used in the longer range, the seasonal and beyond. And I was going to say that I wish I could make a forecast for 100 years because I would sleep a lot better at night, right? When you have to make a forecast for next month, 3 months, 6 months, next winter, they'll be right after you if you're wrong. But these people, they're talking about changes. You talked about a doubling of CO2 at 2100. None of them will be around at 2100 to have to face the music or take a bow or get an award. Anyway, but thank you for the question.
Mike from Milford, thank you for taking our questions. I'm an empiricist and a ham operator. So to me, the 11-year solar cycle is quite important. How does the Earth temperature lag, number one? Does that influence the purported melting of the permafrost and the freeing of all the trapped carbon dioxide in there? Number three, the purported reversal of the Atlantic conveyor current and its effect upon the planet. And the final thing, is the North Pole really headed for Boston?
The North Pole is moving, working backwards, heading toward Russia. I don't know why, but no, it does meander. And it's going to affect, if you have a compass, it could be misleading. But working backwards, the solar cycles, there are 11-year cycles that range anywhere from 9 years to 14 years. The last one was 14 years. And the magnitude of the solar cycle is a significant factor. The lag is there. It's not immediate. It's 8 years. Some people believe it could be as little as 5, as much as 10. And it's if you get two back-to-back quiet cycles like we are in the midst of now, the effect is going to be magnified downstream. So we're expecting that people could be surprised. Look at the snow was falling this last weekend, still in the mountains of the West, and had them surprised. And this will be hot weather this next week or so, but in general, North America is cooling. In terms of the ocean cycles, they go through a 60-year cycle where the current speeds up and slows down, the water warms and cools in the North Atlantic. That has an effect on winters in Europe and the United States, North America. It also has an effect on the Arctic ice, but I think the sun is behind the changes in the oceans. I showed you that they go inside the graphs, and the oceans we use the oceans and the sun in a model that looks at 23 different inputs and predicts that 1 or 2 seasons in advance. We've had very good luck over the last 6 or 7 years with that.
I'd ask a two-part question. What can ordinary citizens and taxpayers do to confront what I would call the global warming hoax? And let me just give you an example. I'm reading from climate.nasa.gov, which is funded by all of us, and it says, scientific consensus, Earth's climate is warming. Multiple studies published in peer-reviewed scientific journals show that 97% or more of actively publishing climate scientists agree. So that's taxpayer-funded propaganda. So what can we do to combat this?
It is propaganda. It's marketing. It's 4 out of 5 doctors recommend, right? Ivory soap is 99 and 44, 100% pure. 97% of the scientists agree, so don't even bother asking me. That is actually in testimony in front of Congress how a Greenpeace or Sierra Club leader responded to tough questions that came from the congressman that knew something about climate. What did they say? I'm going to go with the 97%. Let me just show you. I have another slide here. Thought this might come up. The IPCC you mentioned had expanded the range. They also admitted they have poor understanding of things like clouds and solar and air-sea interaction, but still believe that they were 95% certain they were going to be right in the end. The summaries don't jive with science. There was also the claim that 97% of all scientists believe we're responsible for climate change and extremes. It was based on 2 surveys. The first one was an online survey by college graduate students of 10,000 scientists, which they got 3,000 responses. They chose 77 of those who published climate papers, and they asked them 2 questions. When compared with pre-1800 levels, do you think that the mean temperatures have risen? My answer would have been yes. 1800 was the mini ice age. That doesn't mean we did anything, you know. Second, do you think human activity is a significant contributing factor in changing mean global temperatures? I'd say yes, too. Urban heat island is one, right? And also the way they're making adjustments, they're affecting the changing global temperatures that, that they claim are real, and they're not. They followed up that study. They knew we attacked that pretty good. So Cook, out of Australia, who started out as a cartoonist, he did a consensus study. It was thoroughly refuted. He claimed that 97% of published papers agreed that man was responsible, but it turned out to be only 41 papers. He looked at 11,944, and 41 out of that actually said, yeah, man is responsible for what I'm showing you. If you look at the numbers, it turns out then to be 0.3% of the science to say, in the papers, to say it's absolutely certain in our thinking that we're responsible, not 97%. But the 97% lives, like the 4 out of 5 doctors.
Hi, I wondered if you weren't familiar with the Heartland Institute and the public and what they publish, the environmental and climate activities, and the sponsorship of their annual convention of people who are talking about all the wrong science. Are you familiar with them out of Chicago?
I really didn't hear it very well. I'm sorry.
There's an institute called the Heartland Institute out of
Yes,
Chicago. Are you
I
familiar with
presented. I've worked with them over the years. Yes.
And they publish a newspaper that we get in Concord every month.
Yep.
And they have a lot of the corrections on a lot of this false data. And
Yep.
why is the media not picking up on that?
They're demonized. And actually, I've got their journals. I could stack them this high. And when they did reports, they actually went in and looked at papers and cited all the papers that agreed with the results that they, unlike the UN report, a lot of the citations in the UN reports were term papers, were college master's thesis, or, and they really weren't deep scientific papers and great findings. There were many that were, but of course there were the well-paid scientists in the world were, producing those. But yes, the Heartland is. I highly recommend the work that they do. Let me add. You might recognize this man, and we sorely miss him. Michael Crichton. Mm-hmm. He was. Had a biology degree, then an MD from Harvard, taught at MIT. He taught at Cambridge in the UK, researcher at the Salk Institute. He was obviously a playwright. You enjoyed his movies and books. He said historically the claim of consensus, and this is what 97% is. They're trying to say, don't go down that path because the consensus of 97% of all scientists say it's real. Let's just deal with what we can do about it. He says consensus is the first refuge of scoundrel. It's a way to avoid debate by claiming that the matter is already settled. He wrote the book State of Fear. When you hear the consensus of scientists agrees on something or other, reach for your wallet because you've been had. Let's be clear, the work of science has nothing whatever to do with consensus. Consensus is the business of politics. And that's what this is. It's politically driven agenda. Consensus is irrelevant in science. What is relevant is reproducible results. We see that the results that they keep projecting, sea levels rising rapidly, snow disappearing, the temperatures, heat waves increasing, temperatures rising at a tremendous rate. None of that is happening. And in the real world, the greatest scientists in history, he said, are great because they broke with the consensus. Galileo, Newton, Einstein. There is no such thing as consensus science. If it is consensus, it isn't science. If it's science, it isn't consensus, period.
Representative Max Abramson, I vote for Max's for less taxes. I get asked this question a lot, and I don't have a group of charts or a straight answer. I've always said that the solar cycle seems to be the biggest contributor to climate change and the increasing number of weather events. But as far as human activity is concerned, if it's not CO2, would you say it's more water vapor or methane or urban heat traps, or what is it that human beings are doing that are actual contributors?
Well, urban heat island is the biggest, as Tom Carl, when he was back in his early days, said 6 degrees per century. And we see it every day in the cities, trap the heat at night and they're warmer. Water vapor, water is a significant greenhouse gas. And when it's humid, you can count on temperatures being warmer at night and a little less hot during the day because that's being evaporated. But we haven't, we're not making the rain, so we're just, those are the primary ways man, influences the climate. Climate change will happen whether or not we're, here or not. But we locally affect the climate, and we all live, locally and feel the effects.
Joe, you're spending a lot of time talking about the potential for large hurricanes in the future. Why don't you spend a minute, spin us up on that concern?
Well, we know, and we've watched a lot of hurricanes in the last several years affect our friends in the South and Southeast and Hawaii and the islands. We've had some great hurricanes here in the Northeast. In the 1938 up until 1960, we had 8 major hurricanes here in the Northeast, in the East, in the United States. The 38 hurricane may be the worst ever. 2 billion trees came down in New York State and New England in the 38 hurricane. 2 billion. Now, the number of trees, or percentage of land with trees, has increased dramatically since the early part of the last century. We also have double the population and twice as many homes. If we had a hurricane of 38, which came in from the ocean, moving at well over 60 miles an hour, Category 3, with 176 mile an hour peak winds to the right, the tree fall would be tremendous across New York and New England. And as we're doing a 4-part series on Hudson Cable TV on that, we brought up Joe Bastardi, his father, Matt, who was actually 90 years old, and you wouldn't believe it, it's like Fred. He's, very sharp at 90. And he was in the hurricane of 38 in Providence. He was also in Hurricane Carol in 1954 in Providence, and he talked about those. And they had great storm surge of 13 to 20 feet, and, the damage there. We don't have a storm surge issue here. They do on the seacoast. But can you imagine it with all those trees? So many trees came down. I walked through my neighborhood. We're going to include this in the show. And most every house has trees, southeast of the house, sometimes many trees. And trees are wonderful. I love deciduous trees, right? They shade your house in the summer. The pretty leaves that fall, you don't mind raking. Then in the winter, you got the sunshine through the trees to warm your house. It feels great. You open the blinds. My dog said, ah. And, but those trees start coming down. and they've fallen all over the streets, right? Almost every other house will have some tree damage in that kind of storm. And then try to deal with that. These storms occur in October. You don't have much time, right, before winter set in. Remember Sandy in 2012? 2 weeks after that, we had a snowstorm. How are you going to get the trees off your house when you may have a friend who's a tree man, right? Well, he's going to be probably contracted by the Eversource or the city, towns, to help clean up the trees from the streets first. And then maybe he can schedule you in the end of December. And then you got to get a contractor to repair your roof. That's pretty scary, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And so we talked to a woman with Flash, Federal Alliance for Safe Houses, and she gave us some advice. You should have, at this time in the hurricane season, just in case, you should be stacking in your pantry a whole shelf of food that could keep you eating for a couple of weeks, because if you had all this tree damage, you're not going to get in your car and go down to the shopping. You should keep $500 in your house, cash, she said. So that, because if you can get to the supermarket, they may not have their computers working, and you can only do business with cash. So those are the kind of things. Think seriously about, I had a tree man out this year to remove some of the dead trees and branches over my house. If I had more money, I would have said, take down the big oak in front, southeast of my house, and the big maple on the east side, just in case. I could, and then it comes the power. What are you going to do without that? Everybody's got a portable generator after those ice storms, right? Well, most everybody does. But how long is that going to last if you can't get more gasoline for it? So one of the selectmen in the town, he put in a propane generator and 400-gallon propane tank. He says, I got an automatic set up so that if the power goes off immediately, it switches over to the generator and keep me going for a month. Now, that may not be long enough, but it's a good start, So I'm not saying you need to rush out tonight or tomorrow, this weekend, this week to deal with that, but think about it. If you're having tree work done, if you get a nice bonus, win a lottery ticket, take some of that money and think about how you can make your house safer in case it happens again. Hopefully it doesn't happen in our lifetimes, but if it does, it'll be something will be incredible.
My question is, where do you see some hope? You said that there's not much hope for press and in science. I don't know how many years for them it would take to realize that their models are not working. Or in politics, Trump, he somehow slowed down this process, but he's not a scientist, he doesn't teach people. And Democrats are now pushing to ban planes and farting cows, and even Republicans here, Kelly Ayotte, she was campaigning on climate change. And Republican presidential candidate Bill Weld, he was here in New Hampshire last week, and he said, white mountains won't be white anymore, and all this stuff. So where do you see some hope?
We have a lot of education to do. This is a start. We are working on the administration every which way we can through people that are willing to listen and are open-minded. But you're right. It doesn't matter which party you are. There are many of them who are willing to. Let's go at least with a carbon tax to start. No.
Question here.
Hi, my name's June Branscombe, and I'm from Bow, New Hampshire. I'm going to ask you a question that has plagued me for, I won't say how many years, but when I was physically more fit, I went climbing up to the flume here in New Hampshire. I found a rock, and in the rock was etched in stone by some scientists that said that due to the change in the way the Earth was rotating on its axis, that we were going to see New England become Florida and Florida become New England. I've watched the weather news for almost several years, and I'm watching our storms and weather looking more like our weather in the Cape. So I'm seeing a slow progression. Prediction was like 2,000, 3,000 years. Is there any truth to that stone? It's really haunted me for a long time.
Well, I heard today about Glacial National Park very quietly are removing signs that say glaciers will be gone by 2020. Why are they doing that? Because the glaciers are growing. Now, there's some truth that continental drift is probably still going on so slowly we would never see it. But we are just the natural 60-year cycle, and the changes in the ocean affect whether we have El Nino or La Nina, and affect whether the snows in northern New England or down in Washington, D.C. and New York City, and over many years and decades. So there are some changes that go on naturally due to natural factors, but I wouldn't let that stone keep you up at night.
No, this lady in red.
Hi, I'm Di Lothrop from Nashua. I've enjoyed your talk tonight. I've learned a lot, and so thank you very much. I have a very quick and easy question for you. I'm going to the UK in September to visit my family in Liverpool. Middle of September, what's the weather going to be like?
Let me.
Come on, Joe, do it.
Well, they talk about UK, the summer is one hot day and a thunderstorm. So it's pretty moderate, I'd bet. I spent a fair amount of time in the UK and I loved it.
My name is Joan.
Yes, Joan.
The educational system has been pushing climate change and global warming from elementary school all the way up to college and universities. Where are the scientists and how are they being taught in theory? Since you hear more one-sided than you do the other, there's no balance. That would be my question. And one item of interest, if anybody is interested, go on the internet and research Agenda 21. And that'll give you all the information you need to know about climate change and the redistribution of wealth in this country.
They changed it to 2030 now. It's Agenda 2030.
Agenda 21, 2030 now.
It's the same story, just push it out. Just like the sea levels will drown New York City now. It didn't happen by 2013. It'll be 2025 now. So. But you asked a question that concerns me as a teacher. I was 6 years a college professor. I taught my students how to think, not what to think. That doesn't happen anymore. A lot of the teachers that I speak to have left the field, and they've been replaced by environmental scientists. They have sustainability programs in most all of the colleges, and they brainwash the students from the elementary school right up through college, and they come out and you can't change their mind.
We need to change this.
Yes, we have to work on that.
Okay, we have time for one more question. I think, John, you got your hand up.
One of the things that
Excuse me, John. Wait. Need the microphone.
One of the things that I've been concerned with throughout this is logical fallacies. You can find a simple list, a few pages long online, of logical fallacies. And every one of these things has involved argument from authority, argument from numbers, argument from popularity, argumentum ad nauseum, and so on. And we see the death of logic.
I agree 100%. I have a professor friend in the University of Hartford, and the school has been trying to corral him, and he can't talk about climate, deniers or the possibility that it's natural. But what he did to get around that is he had a class of 12 students, and he said, listen, we're going to talk about climate. I'm going to give you information here on both sides, and you go off and you do the research, come back and tell me what you think. And by the way, how do you feel? And all but one said, we believe in it. We've heard this for years, that it's real. At the end of the course, he said, you present your results. Well, it went from 11 to 1 in favor of man-made climate change to 1 to 11. They said, when we looked at the data and looked at the facts, it's not true. And the teacher that teaches science in that school came to him and said, what did you do to my students? And now they're questioning me. They never asked me questions before in class. They never challenged me.
I'm a great fan of an individual named W. Edwards Deming, and he was the inventor of what is now called statistical process control and total quality management. He came up with these concepts back in the late 40s, tried to get them into American business, and nobody was interested. So he went to Japan, and they took it up, and they revolutionized their industries and pretty much drove us out of consumer electronics, almost out of the automobile business, in which I worked for years. But the thing I love that Deming said, in God we trust, others bring data. And I hope tonight, with the help of Joe here, you've seen some data and you have some things to say back. So Joe, thank you very much for your work tonight and your work in total. Thank you very much for coming, folks.